Good morning, this is your Stats Sensei, Mr. Spensei, and this is a warm-up on reading computer printouts, and we're going to cover a couple things we haven't before. First thing, as we always said, find the word constant, because the word constant tells us everything on that row relates to the y-intercept. So this is my y-intercept row, and the row directly below that happens to be my, hold on a second, I'm gonna get a little padding under there. The row under that happens to be my slope row. So the alcohol is my slope row. All right, so the very first thing it asks for is our explanatory variable. I want to highlight this EX. That tells me, EX tells me this is my X variable. And my X variable in this case is alcohol in liters per year. All right, my y-intercept. Well, y-intercept is going to be on the y-intercept row. And hold on just a second. I'm going to go back and label alcohol as A because this is our first one. Our y-intercept is going to be on the y-intercept row, and it's the very first number, and that happens to be B, which is 260.5633. The next thing it asks for is our slope, and not surprisingly, it's going to be on our slope row, and it's directly below the y-intercept. And in this case, we have a negative slope, and we need to pay attention to that negative because that may impact us later. So we have a negative slope, which means we have a downward going slope. The regression equation, as I've said before, you can't find directly on the computer printout, but it's based on what we learned in Algebra 1, which is y equals mx plus b, where b was our y-intercept and m happened to be our slope. However, for statistics, we change it up and we're going to go y hat equals b plus mx. B is still our y-intercept, and m is still our slope, but we just go in this particular order. And I do want to say that the calculator uses different letters, and that can be a little bit confusing, but I wanted to be consistent with what you've already seen in Algebra 1. So we're going to start off with y hat, and I'm going to need to shorten this up. I'm going to make it 260.56. And we have a minus 22.96. And we'll put an X there. All right. Please note, this is my y-intercept, and this negative right here, that's my slope. Then it asks for the standard deviation of the residuals. All right, that can be a little bit confusing because sometimes this is referred to as standard deviation, but it's standard deviation of the y-intercept or standard deviation of the slope. We want standard deviation of the residuals, which is in a completely different spot, and we note it by a capital S. So I don't know where that capital S is going to show up. It usually shows up here, but the capital S is our standard deviation of the residuals, which in this case is 37.8786. 37.8786. Then it asks for the t statistic for the slope. And by the way, you know what? I should talk to you about the standard deviation of the residuals. That's where you find it. But there's actually other information on here that shows you where it comes from. If I take that value right there and I go 24391.37 and I divide it by 17, what do you know? I end up getting, so this value divided by this value equals that. And you're like, okay, so what? Well, what happens if I take the square root of that? If I take the square root of this, which I do by raising to the half power, I end up getting S. So this equals S, or the standard deviation of the residuals. Because when I take the square root of that, I get 37.87. which is also the standard deviation of my residuals. So taking the square root of that gives me standard deviation of residuals. And I wanted to point that out to you guys. All right. The next thing, t statistic for the slope. Well, I see the word slope, and I actually see it 2 times. So I know that these next two are going to come off the slope row. And I should put an E by this. So t statistic for the slope. So it's like, oh, t statistic on the slope. This must be my F, which is negative 6.4566. And the last one is the p-value, which is right here. And we have two of them, but we don't want the y-intercept. We want the slope. In this case, they're both 0, but we want the one off of specifically off of the slope row. So this is letter G. Then the next thing it asks for is correlation coefficient. Well, the correlation coefficient isn't specifically on here. And it's made out of two things that we have off of this. One, we're going to need the sine of the slope. And in this case, I have the word slope in there. So it's like, oh, I need the sine of the slope. Well, what is my sine of my slope? When I look at the sine of my slope sign is negative. So I'm going to need a negative there. And then I'm going to need the square root of r squared. Well, turns out on r squared, I happen to have two of them. But as I've said before, we'll never use the r squared adjusted in this course. So we're going to be looking at this, but we need to convert it into a decimal. So we're going to take 71.03 divided by 100. It's always divide percents always by 100. So 71.03 divided by 100 is 0.7103. And we're going to have to take the square root of that value. So I do that by raising it to the half power, and I get 0.8427. So my correlation coefficient is a negative 0.8427. Please don't forget correlation coefficient, sine of the slope, and the square root of r squared. All right. Hope this helps. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thank you.